Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Welcome Facebook page. My name is Sarah Casada, and I am on the Welcome team and help manage our online community, which is a digital community for Christian women who are interested in learning about biblical hospitality and what it looks like to welcome immigrants and refugees in the U.S. I'm the author of Love Undocumented, which is a book about immigration and faith. And I'm so excited to be a part of this community and to help facilitate this conversation today. I am joined by two folks from World Relief, Jenny Yang and Matthew Soerens, and they are experts on this topic that we're going to talk about today. And I would love for them to introduce themselves. So Jenny, if you'll get us started.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jenny Yang, and I'm based in the Baltimore, Maryland area. I am the Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy, and so I oversee all of our relations with the government and all of our various advocacy initiatives. And I'm close to DC, and so I travel to DC and try to keep track of what Congress and the administration is doing around immigration, and really providing that information to you all so that you all can also be informed and take appropriate actions as well. I again live in Baltimore and married with two little boys.
Wonderful. Matt.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Soerens. I also work at World Relief. I work from our office in Aurora, Illinois, so west of Chicago. I'm our U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy. So I help with some of the work that Jenny does, but work really closely with local churches in different parts of the country, helping people to think in biblical ways about refugee and immigration issues. And and I'm really happy to be with you all. I also am married. My wife Diana and I have 3 kids, ages 6, 4, and 2. So we have our hands full.
Busy household. And Matt and Jenny co-authored the book Welcoming the Stranger, which does a really great job of unpacking the topic of immigration from a faith perspective, and just has a lot of research and stories that has been a really, really helpful resource for many in this community and then outside as well. Folks who've read it and have commented how important that's been. So we're so grateful for you all joining us today. Things are constantly changing in immigrant and refugee policy. And I know you all know that because you are living and breathing this world and keeping up with all of that. And I think for those of us who are looking on from a little bit of a distance, but wanting to engage, it is so challenging to keep up with what's going on, frankly. And so I'm really grateful for this time because I personally have a lot of questions, and I know our community does as well. Particularly in the news recently, we've seen a lot of changes with our asylum process and our refugee policies as well, or we've heard a lot about that. So I want to just start by asking you to kind of help us be sure that we're on the same page of what is an asylum seeker, what is a refugee, how are they different, how are they the same?
Sure. Do you want me to get started, Sarah? And then, yeah. So it's important to understand the different definitions of a refugee and an asylum seeker. If you're in the United States, it can actually take on different connotations. So a refugee, both actually are individuals who have a well-founded fear of persecution. But a refugee is defined as someone who's overseas and is identified either by the UN or the State Department as an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution based on 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. Now, for an individual to meet that definition, there's around 25 million refugees around the world, and most will not actually be resettled to a country like the United States. But for this fiscal year, the U.S. has set a refugee ceiling for 30,000, and the U.S. is doing its best to try to meet that goal this year. And so an individual who's then identified by the State Department will then be referred to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and then they will be resettled as a refugee to the United States, and they will arrive legally under that status as a refugee. Now, an asylum seeker is someone who...
Real quick, Jenny.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Can you just repeat more slowly those classifications that qualify you for refugee status? Fear of persecution because of race?
Yeah, so it's your race, your religion, your nationality, membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. So you have to basically have a persecution based on one of those 5 grounds. But if you are an individual that is fleeing a disaster like an earthquake or like a hurricane, you do not technically meet the definition of a refugee because you're not fleeing persecution based on one of those 5 grounds. So the US offers some protection for those individuals on a limited basis if you do flee humanitarian disasters like that. But to be a refugee, you do have to meet that very narrow definition in order to qualify as a refugee. So, for example, at World Relief, a lot of the refugees we are serving are individuals that are have fled because they were, media personnel and targeted, or they were Christians and persecuted because of their religion,
Mm.
or these were individuals that are fleeing, particular conflicts in the areas in which they were living. So those are all reasons as to why you would qualify as a refugee. Now, for an individual who pretty much faces the same circumstances, so you do have a well-founded fear of persecution based on those 5 grounds again, but you decide to basically try to come into the United States and basically have the protection of the United States offered to you by either crossing a border, or you can come on a plane. And once you land in the United States, also claim asylum as well. In our current laws, you have to claim asylum within 1 year of arrival into the United States.
Okay.
And so that is a person who didn't have that status before coming, but is seeking the protection of the state of the United States. And thus you are considered an asylum seeker. So for these individuals, both a refugee and asylum seeker, you are fleeing persecution. The issue is, where are you? So for refugee, you're identified overseas and brought into the United States. Whereas if you're an asylum seeker, you're overseas and trying to gain the protection of the United States of America. So for a lot of asylum seekers that are coming, they're coming a lot from Central America and even South America and parts of Africa as well. But what you see in the refugee program is a more diverse nationality of individuals that are coming from Africa, parts of the Middle East, and other places who traditionally don't have geographic access necessarily to the United States of America. But I think both avenues are important to recognize as the United States, because those 2 grounds are pretty much the only the avenues of immigration someone has if you're fleeing persecution to access the protection of the United States.
No, that's really helpful. And so, just so I'm clear, people who apply for refugee status do that from their home country and are assigned a country where they will go to for that protection, correct?
That's correct. So most refugees, again, will never be resettled. And in the United States, we resettle less than half of 1% of the world's refugees. So this is a very limited avenue that most refugees will never be able to gain. And in fact, you can't necessarily choose to be resettled. You actually have to be identified by the UN or the State Department and offered resettlement. So for most refugees, you can't raise your hand and say, I want to go to the United States. You have to be selected because you're particularly vulnerable and cannot return home or locally integrate. And that's why you're offered resettlement, because that's the life-saving protection you have, because the circumstances are so dire for that individual. So I think those is important to recognize as well, that not everyone can choose to come here. Even if they wanted to, you have to be selected because of your particular situation.
Oh, that's really helpful information. Thank you, Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just dive right in then, because lately there's been a lot of talk about this phrase, the refugee ceiling. And I don't know if all of us know what that means. And so I'd love to kind of get a little background of that from you. And then also, why is it coming up right now? Why are we seeing that in the headlines?
Sure. So every year, the government starts a new fiscal year on October 1st. And so the refugee ceiling is determined by the president. The Refugee Act of 1980 authorized the refugee resettlement program, in which the State Department partners with 9 agencies, including World Relief, to basically resettle refugees. Now, the president has to consult with Congress, and then after consultations, then determine what he thinks or she thinks potentially the ceiling should be for that fiscal year. So historically, the U.S. has had the refugee ceiling at around 95,000 refugees per year. Of course, the past few years have been a bit of an anomaly in that we're seeing drastically low numbers than the 95,000 traditional average. But in the early 1980s, when the Refugee Act was first implemented, we resettled around 200,000 refugees per year. And that was in response to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis that we were experiencing at that time. And since 1980, we've seen large numbers of refugees coming in that have really superseded what we're even doing now in terms of refugee resettlement. So the president every year, because he has to set the ceiling before the end of the fiscal year, we know that the State Department right now is making deliberations around what the refugee ceiling would be for fiscal year 2020, which again starts in 2 weeks on October 1st. And so right now is a really important time to weigh in with Congress and with the White House to let them know what we believe the refugee ceiling would be. At World Relief, we've advocated that we think the refugee ceiling should be 95,000, which again is a historic average that we've resettled as a country. And especially given the fact that right now we're facing the world's worst refugee crisis. So we know that the President Trump will be making that decision soon in consultation with Secretary Pompeo and others within the administration. And so it's been really alarming because 30,000, which is the refugee ceiling for this year, is already dramatically lower than the numbers we've seen before. But what we've heard in news reports is that they're even considering lowering that number to even lower than 30,000. So it could go down to, we heard reports that they were going to zero out the program, which is obviously completely shocking. We've also heard that it could be any number between 0 and 30,000. So we're waiting right now, but we're trying to do everything we can to raise our voice with members of Congress. Actually, just this morning, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, and Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat from California, sent a bipartisan letter as chair and ranking members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, telling the State Department that they need to consult with these two members and the Judiciary Committee before they set a refugee ceiling, again, which needs to happen before October 1st. So time's ticking away, and we believe these consultations are important because it provides an opportunity for Congress to influence the process, and again, hopefully keep the numbers at 30,000, if not higher, for the next fiscal year.
Absolutely. And something you said that I recently saw a chart on, and I was a little bit blown away to see how when we started the program, how many did you say, 200,000 a year?
So in the early 1980s, it was around 200,000 that we resettled, mostly from Vietnam. And the numbers just, it was in response to the geopolitical crisis back then. And it's fluctuated over the years. And so we've had, 90,000, 100,000 some years. What's really interesting, though, is that right after 9/11, the program never completely stopped. In fact, President Bush at that time continued the program, and we resettled, I think, around 27,000 refugees that year, even though we had a major terrorist attack on our soil. And so it speaks to the fact that the program enjoys large bipartisan support, and it's also a vital foreign policy tool that our diplomats have used to really open protection dividends for some of the world's persecuted as a durable solution for them.
Absolutely. So I will admit that I didn't know much about the refugee ceiling until the last couple of years. And so I think that's why seeing that chart was so shocking to me, because it was exactly like you said. It had kind of hovered around 95, 100, 95, 100, and then we just kind of see it start to steadily go down. And your comment about 9/11, I think this is just a really good point for people who aren't familiar with the refugee program, just to make sure it's clear that this is a heavily vetted program. So people who go through that process submit. Well, you should probably answer this. I won't start.
Yeah,
what they submit.
It is probably, I would say it's the most rigorous way that an individual can actually legally come to the United States. The reason I say that is because every single refugee that comes in has to have a face-to-face interview with a Department of Homeland Security officer. So this officer is trained to, weed out individuals that either don't meet the definition of a refugee or are not who they say they are. And so only individuals who pass those screenings. You also have to have medical screenings. You have interagency checks. So all your biometric data is checked against the FBI and national security databases. And normally the average before has been around 1.5 to 2 years at least for an individual to be processed to be able to come into the United States. And so right now for some nationalities, it's actually even longer. And so we have cases of individuals that we've been advocating for that have been waiting for over 2 years, actually. So for certain nationalities, they actually have extra security screenings. And so sometimes the process can be many years long. But I do think it's important to remember that when we talk about refugees, it's not necessarily that these individuals are a national security threat. In fact, in the history of the U.S. refugee resettlement program, there hasn't been a single refugee who's been resettled to the U.S. that has taken the life of an American in a terrorist attack. So that record is pretty phenomenal for the over 3 million refugees that we have resettled as a country. And it speaks to the fact that I think the vetting process is really stringent. And the fact that many of the refugees, when they come here, become law-abiding Americans who are so grateful to be here and are incredible contributors to the economy, and they know how to work through and overcome many challenges and are incredibly resilient. So there's a proud history of this program that many people across the board, especially those in faith communities, have really treasured for a long period of time.
Thank you. Yes, I have one last question about the refugee program. Just kind of, and maybe you've kind of answered this, but maybe just more directly of if the refugee ceiling stays the same, which you said it was 30,000 this year,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or lowers, what does that do for the program, and how does that impact families?
Sure. So I think it would have a drastic detrimental effect on individuals who are able to come. So, for example, right now we have 40,000 individuals in the pipeline. These are individuals who have been vetted, have met the definition of a refugee, are literally just waiting for their paperwork to finalize so that they can come into the United States of America. There's a woman we resettled in our Spokane, Washington office. Her name is Aruj. She actually wrote an op-ed for the Christianity Today, if you want to look it up. She was a Pakistani Christian woman whose husband was basically tortured and beaten because of his Christian beliefs in Pakistan. Now, they fled as refugees. They got separated in the process, and Aruj was able to be resettled to the United States. But she's, for the past 2 years, have been waiting for her husband to join her in the U.S. So her husband is actually in Sri Lanka right now, and he's been having a really challenging time because there's a lot of persecution against Christians in Sri Lanka as well. So imagine fleeing, being tortured in Pakistan as a Christian, and then fleeing to Sri Lanka and also facing similar challenges. He really has nowhere else to go. And the fact that his wife has been waiting for him for around 2 years now in the US means that this is one example of someone who could potentially not come in if the cap is lowered from 30,000 to 15,000. So many nationalities and individuals, this is just one example of families that are separated, where the refugee resettlement program is actually reuniting families through this program. So I think it's critically important that we try to maintain as many slots as possible and at least maintain the 30,000. Because if it does get cut down to 15,000, we know specifically of cases that probably won't come in, or it'll take them 3, 4, maybe even 5 years to come in because the slots are so limited.
Oh, thank you. That's heartbreaking to hear that couple's story, but it's also helpful to remember that these aren't just numbers, they aren't just policies, they're real families that trying to work through this system. Families, honestly, that have already suffered greatly, and so trying to figure out how to be resettled is such a difficult thing, even if all the paperwork is going smoothly. So it's particularly troubling to think that of those challenges. So thank you, Jenny. I want to talk a little bit too about the other side, or not the other side, but the other avenue through the asylum process. Because we talked a little bit about how asylum seekers are facing those same types of persecutions, but it depends on, like you said, Jenny, where they are. And so asylum seekers are claiming asylum from the U.S. They're already on U.S. soil, and they have within a year of arrival to claim asylum. So, and Matt, I think you were going to touch on this. I'd love to hear, we've been kind of hearing this phrase, the asylum ban. Can you explain that and kind of clarify what's been happening with our asylum seeking policies?
Sure. So as Jenny explained, asylum is basically, it's people who claim to meet the definition of a refugee. They're saying they have a story that's similar to the people who have already been vetted by the U.S. government abroad. And to be really clear, some of them are I think absolutely have fled a well-founded fear of persecution for one of those reasons under the law. Some of them really haven't. They're fleeing poverty or they're fleeing a natural disaster. And I may be personally sympathetic, but they wouldn't get approved through our asylum process. And there's also some cases that are probably kind of gray. Like it's not always an open shut case, or you are fleeing persecution, but you don't have evidence of it. So there's a whole range within those people. And that includes people who come in through an airport, usually on a tourist visa. But I think it's important to know that most people in the world cannot get a tourist visa to come to the United States. Unless you're fairly wealthy or from a fairly wealthy country, you're usually going to be denied that tourist visa. Yeah. So for many people, the only hope is to somehow get geographically close to the United States and get to the border. You can't apply at the consulate in your country. I mean, if you do so, you're basically requesting to be considered for the refugee program. And your odds last year are, less than 0.1% who got resettled, and that could go down even further. Mm-hmm. But so people who can get near to the United States, if they can get to the border, they have the right under U.S. law to request asylum. Where this idea of an asylum ban has come into play, and that the language is a little bit imprecise because there are still people being approved for asylum. We haven't gotten rid of those laws altogether. But you have had the administration, so there's been no changes in law. Congress has done nothing in this area, but the administration has added several ways that it has become much more difficult to win an asylum case, especially for those who come via land across Mexico. So the most significant of those is a rule that was announced a couple months ago and then was held by the courts for a few weeks. And then most recently, the Supreme Court has allowed this rule into effect pending further court hearing. So they haven't ruled that it's constitutional or not, but they've said it can go into effect for the moment. Basically, what that rule says is that if you are requesting asylum and you have crossed over from Mexico and you did not request asylum first and be denied in either Mexico or one of the other countries that you passed through, that you are ineligible. Full stop. So it doesn't matter, they're not even going to get to the question of, do you have a well-founded fear of persecution for your race or your religion, your political opinion, your national origin, your social group. It doesn't matter that you can prove that you do. And I mean, for example, I was in Tijuana last month and we met a young man from Venezuela. He's a student activist. He's made his way all the way up from South America. And if people are aware of what's happening in Venezuela right now, there's really horrific political oppression, and particularly for activists. And actually, one of our colleagues at World Relief is representing his case, but he will probably be denied at this point because when we met him last month, the rule was on hold, but he was waiting in Mexico for his turn to request asylum. And by the time that he got to the border to request asylum, this rule was in place. And so even though he has a well-founded fear of persecution, at least he's persuaded me, I haven't seen all of his evidence. Our colleagues who do legal representation will help, build the case for him based on the evidence he can get of that his fear of persecution is credible because of his political activism. But it doesn't matter, actually, if he is found to be credible, if he went through Mexico and didn't get denied in Mexico first or in one of the other countries he passed through.
Okay, I'm going to stop you because I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, you said is it at least one of the countries that he's passed through, or is it every country that you've passed through? And does it have to be Mexico?
Yeah, my understanding is you have to show you've applied and been denied in one of those countries.
One of those countries.
But one thing, so that in some ways it seems sort of logical. Well, what's wrong with Mexico? Well, there's a few reasons, or Guatemala, or somewhere else that he's passed through. The biggest reason that, though it may sound reasonable, is I believe actually not reasonable, is that Mexico has very limited infrastructure to process and adjudicate asylum claims. So Mexico does grant some people asylum. In fact, their definition for asylum is a little bit more generous than the United States. So it's actually fairly unlikely you're going to see a lot of people who get denied in Mexico who would then be approved in the United States. The problem is you won't get a decision in Mexico. Their asylum office at the federal level gets Mexican taxpayer funding of about $1 million per year. I mean, we have World Relief offices in the United States with budgets of significantly more than $1 million per year. That doesn't go very far to run an entire federal agency. So people will apply and they're basically being sent to a bureaucratic brick wall. I mean, Guatemala, it's even less than that. Almost no one has applied for asylum in Guatemala. In fact, tons of people have left Guatemala to seek asylum elsewhere in the last few years. That's the top country of origin, I believe, of those coming to the U.S. But the idea that Venezuelans or Nicaraguans or Hondurans or Salvadorans should just be happy in Guatemala, it's not that they're going to request asylum and be denied. It's that they're going to request asylum. And if this process really diverts tens of thousands of cases to those countries, they'll never get a decision. Yeah. And then you can also look at the reality that I mean, is the whole point of asylum is to provide safety to people fleeing persecution. Again, Guatemala has a significant gang problem of their own, and it's not clear that people from El Salvador would actually be safe there. Mexico is, especially in the border regions, there's parts of the border that are extremely dangerous that the U.S. government advises U.S. citizens not to visit under almost any circumstance. We've seen situations of, for example, a pastor who is a Mexican pastor serving asylum seekers, in this case from Cuba, and he was kidnapped. We still don't know. I mean, we don't know where he is, if he's alive or not, but who's been kidnapped because he's helping Cuban asylum seekers in Mexico. So it's a real concern for us. It's just the well-being of those people. And it's worth noting that at least the stats that we have as of the spring of the people who had reached the United States at that point, about 40% of them are children. So this is affecting a lot of kids, and some with their parents, some unaccompanied. The unaccompanied kids actually get treated differently under the law if they arrive without a parent, and that's probably helpful. But especially those who arrive with their parent, there's a lot of families in border communities in Mexico right now. I was, again, I'll actually be, Lord willing, I'll be there in the El Paso Juarez area on Wednesday and visit one of the shelters that we've visited in the past where local churches in Mexico are doing really heroic things to help people, but their capacity is very limited. And that's one other dynamic I should mention. It used to as recently as like June, most families who would show up and request asylum would be held for a while in the United States by the U.S. government. And then, presuming that they passed a criminal background check, they had a credible fear, like they had at least a decent chance of winning an asylum case on a preliminary analysis by our government, they would be released into the United States, usually with an ankle bracelet on the parents to make sure they show up for court. But then most of them have family in the U.S. they could go to. And there were churches in places like El Paso and elsewhere on the northern side of the border helping them. That's dramatically slowed down because the vast majority of people are now being returned to Mexico to wait for their asylum hearing. It's called Remain in Mexico, or sometimes called MPP, the Migration Protection Protocols, which, again, given the state of Mexico's border regions, I would argue is a misnomer.
You know, there was a group from Welcome of women who just went to El Paso Juarez just, I guess, 2 weeks ago now. And I think that was seeing those policies really acted out and seeing how that was impacting both the El Paso side, where former shelters were now empty, but then on the Mexican side, where you're seeing just huge volumes of migrants waiting for their different dates. And even when we were there, the day before we had gone, they were saying that one of the shelters had been held up, and just realizing how vulnerable those migrant families are as they're waiting in Mexico. As well as, and I think this is what you maybe were alluding to when you said your friend from Venezuela was waiting for his opportunity to claim asylum. And so we really saw, even on the Juarez side, when you talk, we use this phrase metering, where you kind of had officials intercepting people on their way to the U.S. and turning them back, rather than letting them get to the U.S. where they would legally be allowed to claim asylum.
Yeah. So when we talk about an asylum ban, in some ways it's a layer after layer of policy that's making it much more difficult to ever win an asylum claim. So for example, this young man from Venezuela, when I met him last month, he had tried to walk across at the bridge with his Venezuelan passport. He doesn't have a visa. They won't give him one, but to say, I'm here to request asylum. Well, he met those people who were told, actually, you can't get up to that line where you'd have a legal right to request asylum. Go wait your turn in line. And in the Plaza Chaparral in Tijuana, people are waiting 4 to 5 months before they're, sometimes it's 10 people called per day, sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's none. But they'll call people sort of in the order they showed up. And that's before you even get into the Remain in Mexico program. So finally he got in, he'd been waiting for months in Tijuana. He finally gets to the chance to present his request for asylum, but he's still turned back to Mexico under Remain in Mexico. And it's unclear how many months he'll be there, which the other dynamic of that Remain in Mexico program is it's really hard to find U.S. legal counsel who lives in Mexico or who can travel to Mexico. I mean, our colleague can do it on for a few cases, but not a significant amount. It can take hours sometimes just to cross back over the border to the U.S. So it's very difficult. And then the last thing I would say on that metering policy is it's part of the reason we've had such a problem. I mean, if you go to the asylum laws, you can request asylum at the port of entry, or you can request asylum if you are apprehended by the Border Patrol. explicitly under Section 208 of the Immigration Nationality Act. You can do so in either place. Well, of course, it's a much safer and more orderly process to go up to the front door and knock and say, I'm here to request asylum. But when people are told, wait 4 to 5 months, a significant number of them have figured out that maybe they should go out to the desert, hire a coyote, a smuggler, and get out of the danger of that Mexican border region to get to the United States. And that's a significant factor in my mind, that we've seen such a spike in the number of apprehensions of people crossing the U.S. border unlawfully. And I think, if you talk to the Border Patrol, as I have on a number of occasions, they'll tell you it's not so much that they're catching people crossing unlawfully as those people crossing unlawfully, who are mostly asylum seekers, are catching them. They are looking for the Border Patrol. And that is not the most efficient or safe process. It would make much more sense to have adequate staffing at the ports of entry to vet asylum claims. If people have fraudulent claims or spurious claims, then they shouldn't be allowed in. But if they have a reasonable chance of winning a claim, and many of these people do, they should, have the chance to have due process and have the time to find legal representation and present their case in court. And if that takes a few months, if they need to be in the United States, if there's no reason to think they're a public safety threat, to let their families or let local churches who are eager to help support them in the meantime, rather than straining the resources on the Mexican side of the border, where they're not, in the US, people were splitting up to the whole of the United States where they had family. In Mexico, they're pretty well concentrated in a few regions along the border. And those are some of the most dangerous parts of Mexico.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jenny, did you have something you wanted to say about that as well?
Yeah, so I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the migrants that are coming actually have family members in the U.S. So these are individuals that have, cousins or like aunts and uncles. So they're trying to come because they're fleeing persecution in a lot of cases, but they also know that they have community and resources in the United States that they're not going to actually have in Central America. I think the other thing to recognize as well is that what this policy does by turning people back at the border to Mexico or to other places, is that we're basically narrowing asylum based on the validity of a process versus your validity of a claim. So it doesn't matter that you have this horrific persecution story in your home country and you cannot find safety anywhere, but the very fact that you did not follow a specific procedure, which is completely arbitrary and has been made up by the administration, means that you cannot claim asylum in the United States. So KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense, and nonprofit organization, released a study earlier this year that found that the amount of illegal activity, of trafficking, of cartels that are targeting these asylum seekers in Mexico because they're being turned back at the border has increased significantly. And so many of these asylum seekers are now stuck in Mexico and being targeted by, rampant criminals. When I was actually there a few months ago and I was visiting with a local church in Tijuana that was sheltering a lot of these migrants, the pastor there was telling me that when you have individuals that are turned away from the United States, they have to make really difficult decisions. Many of them end up, trying to legally cross again with their young children because they're desperate to leave Mexico and they cannot go home. And the pastor was pleading with me that this policy is actually harming a lot of these individuals because many of them have nowhere to go. He thinks many of them will be in the shelter for a long time. And because they don't have access to legal counsel, they're really at a loss for what they could do to present the most valid claim. So again, I think the process for asylum in the US should be based on the validity of your claim, not on the validity of a process that you followed, which when we know you're being forced to flee from your home can lead to very interesting and unique migratory routes for that individual seeking protection.
That's a really good reminder. I do think, and I've heard this said before of people asking questions, well, why don't folks who are leaving El Salvador, for example, like why don't they want to stay in Guatemala or stay in Mexico? And I think that element, not only of will they be safe from whatever persecution they're originally fleeing, but that draw of I have family in the US that will help me start over can't be understated, because I think that is a really big factor as people are making these really difficult decisions.
Yeah. And Sarah, I think it's also worth mentioning, and this kind of connects back to the refugee ceiling discussion, that these issues are in some ways related as well, right? Because that calculus that someone in El Salvador is making, should I, they're threatening to kill my son, they're threatening to rape my daughter, what should I do? Should I leave? a couple of years ago, like this is as recently as 2017, there weren't a ton of people coming from El Salvador through the U.S. refugee resettlement program, but there was more than 1,100 who came in fiscal year 2017. This year, there will be somewhere around 250. So that's a really sharp decline. And of course, if the refugee ceiling goes down even further, that will presumably go down further as well. And so some people who, I mean, literally they are moving about the country trying to escape this violence that seems to keep following them or their children. Some of them will wait as long as they possibly can, especially if there's some hope of coming through a safe legal channel like the refugee resettlement program. But when those hopes seem to be diminishing or there seems to be no hope of making the cut for that, people make a difficult decision that my only real option is to get to the United States. Even though that means a dangerous journey, people know it's a dangerous journey. People know that the levels of rape and sexual assault are incredibly high and that it's horrific. People know that they're likely to be robbed along the journey at some point. And I think that speaks to the desperation that people are actually fleeing in their countries of origin. When knowing that is ahead of them, many of them still make this decision. And that doesn't mean they all qualify for asylum. I mean, there's really desperate circumstances that are not fleeing persecution for one of the reasons under the law. But there absolutely are people who, from any fair reading would qualify for asylum, at least the way it was being interpreted as recently as 2 years ago.
Yes. And I am curious about that because I did read something recently, and this may or may not be quite in line with the same policy. That's why I'm curious around this idea that if it is a family member that is being threatened, that might not qualify you for asylum. Is that true? And how does that play out? What does that look like?
Yeah. So under the law, as Jenny said, one of the grounds for persecution is membership in a particular social group. You don't see in the law you're fleeing persecution on account of your family. That's not one of the stated groups. But it has historically been understood that a family was a social group. I mean, it was actually, literally in like the asylum immigration law textbooks, it has previously been held up as sort of the prime, like an obvious example of what is a social group. Well, I'm being persecuted because I'm part of this family and the government is persecuting this family. That's my social group. But the one thing that people probably don't realize, I didn't realize working immigration law for 10 years until last year, is that because the immigration courts are part of the Department of Justice, they're not part of the independent judiciary branch of the U.S. government constitutionally. They are under the authority of the Attorney General. And the Attorney General can basically override precedent case law. So Attorney General Barr did so a few months ago to clarify that a family, in most instances, should not be considered a social group. So the fact that your family you can't basically win a case at this point. And this is true for those who come through an airport, not just for those at the border, that if your argument, the reason you think you have a credible fear of persecution is because of who your dad is or your mother is or your sister is and what happened to them, that in itself will not qualify you for an asylum claim in the way that it would have in the past. And also another change that has happened that's similar in redefining who a social group is, and this was happened under Attorney General Sessions a little bit more than a year ago. Attorney General Sessions clarified, using his authority as Attorney General, that you cannot win a case for asylum based on your social group if you are fleeing what's called private violence, which basically means if you're fleeing violence that's not perpetrated by a state. So my friend from Venezuela who's fleeing the Maduro government, I shouldn't say he's my friend, this guy I met from Venezuela who's fleeing the Maduro government might qualify because that's a state actor. But if you're fleeing a gang in El Salvador or Honduras, it doesn't matter that you have a very credible fear of persecution if you can't prove that it's tied to your social group. And if it's not governmentally sponsored, you don't really have a case at this point, which is a significant change in how U.S. asylum law is being interpreted, especially for Central Americans, where that's probably the most common story. And it affects those fleeing domestic violence as well.
That private violence. So let me ask you one more question about the asylum ban, and I'll use air quotes since that's not totally legitimate phrasing. But what is kind of the next step for that idea that you have to apply in the country that you pass through? What does that mean for people who've already claimed asylum and are waiting in Mexico? And then what is kind of the next steps for that legislation or policy? Is legislation even the right word?
It's not legislation. So in some ways it'd be clearer if it was legislation, because a lot of this, I think the next step is probably a decision from a circuit court of appeal, like the Ninth Circuit, which is where California and Arizona's borders are. And then there's a good chance that one side or the other doesn't like what they decide, and that gets appealed to the Supreme Court, which may or may not decide to take it. Or you could have the Ninth Circuit, which covers California, rule one way, and a different circuit covering Texas ruling a different way. And that would almost certainly mean the Supreme Court would have to weigh in on what's correct. And the question here is the asylum laws themselves, which are passed by Congress and signed into law back in the 1980s, they spell out who qualifies for asylum. And they don't have this language about you have to pass, if you pass through Mexico, you have to apply another language in another country first and be denied. But they do give some discretion to the administration, to the federal government, in how to further interpret the law. The legal question is, are they pressing this past what is a reasonable understanding of what was meant by the law or not? And that's what higher courts will ultimately decide. For the time being, it leaves a lot of uncertainty. I mean, even for people who have already had their cases, they've applied for asylum, they're often being held in Mexico. There's one thing that is happening is some people aren't showing up for their court hearings after they've been remaining in Mexico. And there could be several reasons for that. One is literally they never got a notice because they don't have a home address in Mexico and there's nowhere to send their notice. That is an incredibly common dynamic right now. Mm-hmm. Another, sadly, is they have been kidnapped or trafficked. Like, that is not an impossibility in that region. Another, though, is they've heard about the new rules and they realize they're just going to be denied. So why even bother? Especially because usually if you're denied an asylum claim, you are then deported to your country of origin. So if you have a genuine fear of Venezuela or El Salvador or Honduras, it might be in your interest to just stay on in Mexico and not go to court and be denied because you didn't first apply for and be denied asylum in your country of origin, rather than being deported to a country where you have a genuine fear of persecution because of your political opinion or your race or your faith or whatever.
So you would expect those who have already received a court date and are waiting for it in Mexico will be held to this standard of, did you apply?
Yeah, it'll depend if they applied before it was first announced, they shouldn't be held to it. But for example, there's people who've been waiting in that metering process for months who at this point will be held to it, from what we understand. And there's a lot that's still unclear about what this looks like in practice.
Okay.
And immigration lawyers, the few immigration lawyers who are representing cases in Mexico are trying to figure that out frantically because it affects the best legal guidance that they would give to their clients. And it literally could be life or death decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whew, okay, related to that, lawyers and courts and all of that. We've seen some stuff about these tent court proceedings, and I feel like we've heard that it's secretive, and so I don't know much about it. And I would like to know more about what's happening, why we've kind of moved to this system, and sort of what's at stake there.
Jenny, you can share more if you know more than I do, but it is rather secretive. So I think it's hard to know exactly what's happening. For the most part, press has not been allowed to cover these. So most immigration court proceedings are public. I mean, anybody can go and sit in the courtroom.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. These ones are not. And that's, I think, concerning because it's hard to know what is actually happening. But one thing that is true is it's by video. So the judge is not along the border. In most cases, he or she is somewhere else. And there's a video screen, kind of like how we are communicating with lots of people right now. And so these folks who've been put into the Remain in Mexico program are told to come to the border at a certain time, at a certain day. And presuming they do show up, they are basically brought into this big tent facility that most of us will never be able to see the inside of. Attorneys can, they do have the right to have legal representation if they can find an attorney in Mexico, which again, at this point, it's far less than 10% have legal representation. And we know that that's probably the single best indicator. And if you're going to win your asylum case or not, is if you have a lawyer or legal representative. We know that if you don't, you're very unlikely to win your case, no matter how strong the merits are, because it's really hard to understand U.S. immigration law. Most Americans don't understand it. It takes someone who's really carefully trained in it. But that's what's happening at these facilities along the border, are these kind of tent courts, and people go and have their next court date. A few people have won their asylum cases who've been in the Remain in Mexico program. Just today I saw an article about a Honduran pastor who was being persecuted by the gangs because his ministry to youth, he's a youth pastor, was basically deterring people from joining gangs. And the gangs weren't happy about that. So they were specifically threatening him for that reason. And he won his case. There was another Honduran evangelical leader who won his case a few weeks ago. But even in that case, the government appealed the decision of the immigration judge. So the government is trying to overrule it at an appeals level and have him deported back, which is really troubling and I think rather unusual.
So I was going to say, this is not standard practice, is it, of how they're...
There's a lot that is very different right now than it would have been. I mean, asylum has never been easy. Asylum has always been very subjective. If you look at the approval rates for asylum from one judge in one immigration court to another, sometimes, across the hall in the same place where you're based in Atlanta, Sarah, they have the reputation of having asylum or immigration judges who have very low approval ratings. If you go to New York, it's above 60%. So it's always been subjective. There's always been a lot of dynamics based on if you have a good lawyer, based on the particular country you're coming from, but it has gotten much, much harder in the last few years, and especially for anyone who's come through Mexico.
Yeah, the Los Angeles Times recently did an article on the latest in these 10 court hearing proceedings, and they found that at least in one court, there were supposed to be 52 individuals that showed up. Only half of them showed up, only 26, again, based on many of the reasons that Matt clarified. And of the 26 that showed up, only 4 had legal counsel. And so the fact that many of these individuals were approaching the U.S. border, were turned away and to basically stay in Mexico, wait the hearings, then to come back into the U.S. and then have their court proceedings in a tent facility, really, again, I think it doesn't bode well for due process for many of these individuals, because especially when you're talking about individuals who were turned away initially and now are coming back, who are experiencing this new policy, to have individuals not be able to see what's actually happening in these court proceedings is really troublesome. And the fact that many of these individuals, again, do not have access to legal counsel, and the fact that many of them are showing up in court without such counsel, means that many of them will probably have a harder time stating their case before the immigration judge and actually being granted asylum eventually. I think what you're seeing now is not just a narrowing of the U.S. ability to offer asylum, but is making the process so difficult that even if you have a valid asylum claim, they're not. The conditions are so that these individuals will have a harder chance to present that claim in front of this judge.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear both of you say that people aren't showing up for their court hearings, because I know historically asylum seekers have had very high rates of showing up for court, which has always been one of the statistics to promote, like, it's okay we don't have to detain people for their asylum hearings. We can let them stay with those family members that are willing to support them rather than them being supported by the taxpayer system. And that there's always this high rate of showing up because people want to go through that process. They believe they have a claim and they want to go through it. So it's interesting to hear that as the policies are shifting so quickly and making it so much more difficult, that people are starting to not come to those court and staying in Mexico instead, essentially.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Like, when people were being released into the United States, more than 80% of asylum-seeking families, as of at least like May of this year, were showing up for court for all their court hearings. And if those who had legal representation, it's like 99%. Almost everyone who really understands what they're doing shows up. And now I think we'll see it's going to be a lot lower than that. And again, some of that is people literally didn't know when to show up. They're having letters sent to them to a non-existent address because they don't have an address to give in Mexico. World Magazine did a really helpful, really troubling, but really accurate report on that dynamic. Sophia Lee, who's a journalist there, that is worth looking up. And just looking at, she did get access to one of the courts in near San Diego, but that's a major dynamic too. It's really not due process. And to be really clear, people say, well, why do we can't just have open borders. I completely agree. We're not saying everyone who shows up should be allowed in. We're saying our asylum laws, which have been on the books for decades, are actually there for a really important reason, to make sure we don't, as a country, send anyone back to a situation of violence or persecution who would qualify. Mm-hmm. But people can't make that case when they're not offered the due process. And that, I think, should be troubling to all Americans, and especially to Christians, who, the majority of these people showing up from Central America are fellow believers. A lot of them, the reasons they're fleeing are tied to their Christian faith and not wanting to be associated with a gang or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And there's just incredible people. And I'm sure there's some bad people in groups of tens of thousands of people too. We should absolutely screen those people out. But to just kind of close the door on a blanket level, I think is really troubling.
Well, I want to get to some action steps before we close out. I'm really, really grateful for you all sharing just such helpful information. And I'll give you a moment to think about this, because I'm also very aware of how heavy all of this is that we're sharing. We've just kind of gone through 3 really big areas of kind of bad news for vulnerable people as we're walking through these policy changes. And so would love to just hear from you all, both as people of faith and kind of how you process some of that, how you get out of bed in the morning when you're sort of dealing with these really difficult situations. Because I think that's something we talk a lot about in the Welcome community to some extent, of we want to engage. And there's that temptation, right? Sometimes to just close our eyes and look away because it's so complicated. I mean, even just sorting through all these policies, it's difficult to stay up to date and then be like, what on earth am I supposed to do in my corner of the world? So I would love to hear from both of you kind of in that dual question of how do you address this as a person of faith, and also what concrete steps do you recommend?
Yeah, so I think it's really important just even to be aware of what's happening. So I think awareness is the first step. So at World Relief, we are posting stuff on social media and releasing statements around policy changes or policy decisions that are important for us to be speaking out on. And so I think just following us on social media so that you're aware of what our position is as a service provider and as an organization that has served immigrants in the U.S. for 40 years is just a good way to start, just to create that awareness around what these policies actually mean. And so I think awareness should actually lead to some kind of action as well. And Proverbs 31:8 says that we are to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are poor and destitute. And I think for many of these immigrants, they feel shuffled around in a system in which they feel like they don't have a voice. And I think for many of us who are following this issue and feel overwhelmed as to how to respond, sometimes we may not need to know every number or every policy, but just picking up the phone and contacting our elected official to tell them or that we have concerns about what's going on, what is their position, what are they doing about it, is good enough. And so our elected officials are making really critical decisions. And sometimes they make these decisions in a vacuum where they don't know how their constituents actually feel about it. And so I think anytime we have a groundswell of people speaking up, it does lead to policy changes. When President Trump last year, or maybe earlier this year, he signed an executive order trying to end family detention because there was a groundswell of individuals being very upset about the fact that families were being separated at the border. So things like that, I think, are critically important. I would also say that I think on a personal level, it is challenging because the day-to-day is really hard. There's always, these policy decisions that are coming down the pike. But I think being a part of a community that can share information and get engaged together is so important. So being engaged in the Welcome community on Facebook, talking with your friends and your family, with your church, with your pastor about your concerns, and creating a community of like-minded believers is critically important, because we're not supposed to journey on this alone. We're supposed to journey on this together. I think creating resources and doing it together is critically important.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Jenny said. I mean, I think this has been a hard year for me personally. Just there's times when I just want to sort of check out from more bad news, and I think about the people that I've met on the border and the people who I've met here in Chicagoland who've got relatives who are directly affected by some of these policies, and I want something better to tell them than I hope something changes. I'm praying for you. But I really have felt convicted that I need to be more faithful in not just telling people I'm praying for them, but be really focused in on prayer, in part, maybe because I've tried everything else I could think of. It's not, the policies just keep getting worse from my perspective. Maybe we should have started more seriously with prayer, and I'm sure many others have been doing so. But I know that I sometimes get so busy that that's sort of an afterthought. I've even found it, I read the scriptures in a new way with some of the dynamics. I was reading in Psalm 94 this morning. It says, just thinking about the people I'll probably interact with even this week as I'm on the border again and facing cartels and traffickers and terrible policies. It says, they crush your people, Lord. They oppress your inheritance. They slay the widow and the foreigner. They murder the fatherless. They say, the Lord does not see. The God of Jacob takes no notice. And it goes on and it says, does he who fashioned the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? Does he who disciplines nations not punish? And just to think that ultimately God is in control. And I know that there's people there along the border. I know that we have brothers and sisters in Christ in places like Iraq and Syria and Iran who often have learned a lot more about relying on prayer than most of us in the United States have to sustain them. But to be praying along with them that there would be a safe place for them, and praying for the country that I'm proudly a part of would once again be that place for at least a reasonable share of those people.
Oh, that was beautiful. That scripture made me tear up. It's powerful to be reminded that God is bigger than these policies. And I think one thing, when our Welcome Women group was at the border earlier this month, it was striking to hear migrants share these really difficult stories, and then to literally just their entire countenance would change and light up when they started talking about their faith and how I know God has protected me. That's how I'm here this far. And God has a plan for my life and is walking alongside me. And it was so convicting and encouraging as a sister in faith to be reminded of their great faith, even in these difficult circumstances. But I appreciate both that call to prayer and also the call to call. I called the White House this morning, and the best part is it's like on your caller ID, like you are calling the White House. And World Relief has great tools for emailing as well. And so I've used those systems, and you guys do a great job of providing just really clear scripts and clear channels to be able to spread that message. And so I'll post some of that in the comments of this webinar. I just want to thank you both for your time. Thank you for those of you who are watching this live. And if you are watching the replay, we're glad you're here, and we hope that you will take this information, grow deeper in your knowledge of what's happening so that you can be moved towards action and community in that. So thank you, Matt and Jenny.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Matt.